And I would really encourage you to take time to reflect and clarify your values and what behaviors come out of that. Finding that, reviewing it, have it in a place where you can see that often can be a great touchstone, I believe, for leadership.
Very excited to have with us as our Pearler, Dan Smith, who's the head of Room Rudy International School in Thailand, where he's previously served as the high school principal. And I think that's when I first met you, Dan, when you were there. Before moving to Thailand, to Bangkok, he headed the Mosaic International School in Hyderabad in India, and he's worked in several US independent schools. He's done lots of really other interesting things, way too long to list here. And he's worked both as a teacher and a leader. We've been fortunate to have Dan with us for several years now, teaching our Leadership and Team Dynamics course for the past few years, and hopefully, Dan, for many more to come. So we're looking forward to your words of wisdom.
Make sure I'll get myself unmuted. I think that's the first wise thing to do is check that you're unmuted. Thanks, Bambi, and a huge thanks and a shout out to the whole PTC team. It was really heartbreaking in the spring as we were looking towards the summer and realizing it just wasn't going to be viable to have the regular PTC. So it's been really exciting to have something like this take its place as best as possible and still have some of those really experiences and the connections and networks and other things that are an important part of the PTC experience. It's been really fun to tune into the others. It's difficult now that we're 12 pearls in to come up with something that's new and not a repetition. And I don't think I'll be repeating, but there will certainly be what I'll call some rhyme. And I think that's a great thing, that there's some harmony and rhyme and echoes between the different things we're hearing from these pearls. I think it says something about the consistency of the values of leadership. I hope I have many years of leadership ahead, but I do know that no matter what happens, I have a couple of people that I will always consider being very, very fortunate to have worked with for a short time in my career. One of them was last year at the PTC, teaching with Chris Bowman. An absolute highlight of my career. He was highlighted yesterday in the Pearl, so I won't say too much more about him. Another person is the one that my Pearl is coming from today, and I've gone a little bit meta because her name is actually Pearl. Pearl Rock-Kane, who is the director of the Klingenstein Center for many, many years, before she passed away about 18 months ago. And I had the pleasure to work with her as a professor while I was completing 2 really intensive summers of graduate school about 12 years ago, and then returned and worked with her as the assistant director of the Klingenstein Center in an interim position between 2 other jobs for about 8 or 9 months. And she was a real powerhouse. And let me go ahead and switch over and share my screen at this point. So I can share my pearl of wisdom, which comes from Pearl Kane. And this was the phrase as she was being remembered that everyone recalled as her mantra, that leadership is a behavior, not a position or a role, she sometimes said. She had a really good sense of behavior. A lot of people would describe it as a polite intensity. And when I was with her in graduate school, there were almost 50 of us in our cohort over 2 summers. And we were in New York City that she really wanted to use as a lab. So she would lead us all over the city on these field trips. We went to Google corporate offices to look at organizational culture, lots of different unique schools. And I know even though we thought we were great, important educational leaders changing the world, I'm pretty sure we looked like this going around New York City. And Pearl was out front, charging us through. We could barely keep up with this nearly 70-year-old, pretty small statured woman. And we were like ducklings trying to just keep up with her. And she would get access to these amazing places, take us through these tours, and we'd get to that culminating moment where here we are with the director or the boards or whatever it was that culminating moment, and she would disappear. She was suddenly gone, and she was handing the moment over to us. We then could ask the questions and have the interactions and the conversations. And that was a behavior of hers that I saw over and over and over. She would build up a great moment and then pass it off for other people to experience. It was really powerful. When I worked with her a couple of years later, one of my main roles was admissions and financial aid for the graduate programs. And there were a lot of applicants, and it was stressful to decide who gets what and where does this go. And when I would meet with her to share final recommendations, she wouldn't ask too much about the applicants themselves. She wanted to know about my process. How did I interview them? Who did I talk with? Who did I talk with, and what kind of questions did I ask? What was my process, or what were my behaviors? And when she was confident that my behaviors to make those decisions were consistent with the mission of the center, she didn't have a lot of questions about the recommendations. Because it wasn't about my position or the positions of those people. It was really about what kind of leadership behaviors were being exhibited. Just one more anecdote about her. She would give an award annually at the Independent School Conference, usually to the big speaker that they had there. And so she would share the stage with Howard Gardner and Oprah Winfrey and Sugata Mitra one year, and one of my favorites, Malcolm Gladwell. And she again highlighted the importance not of his role as an acclaimed writer and author, but she knew what really made him that way was he loved to research and read. He loves research. And so what she gave him was a lifetime library card to the Columbia University Libraries. And he was tickled beyond belief to have that research and reading behavior recognized by her. So behavior as leadership, behavior is the way that we act or conduct ourselves towards others. It's a lot more about how we do things than maybe what we do. As Picard here is reminding us, this is established over time. We can't change it overnight. We build these into our relationships and our connections as leaders with other people, and so they need to be authentic. I've got Gordon Ramsay here is reminding us too that we can't fake it. We have to have integrity. We can't say, I'm not yelling at you if we're yelling at you. We have to be responsible for how our behavior is received, not just how it was intended. That's been a huge lesson for me, and realizing I went through this process, I said this thing or I did this thing, and the reaction wasn't what I thought. And my first instinct has been to explain to somebody how they were supposed to react, and realizing, no, I need to maybe change my behavior or approach, and not try to leverage my role and authority to get them to do or think or say what I want. Behavior is ultimately rooted in our values more than anything else. We live our values. And that happens, I think, more than any other time in stressful moments. We've had some stressful months for lots of different reasons. And we've seen people's values and their real behavior come out of that. Barry highlighted that really well earlier this week, talking about his school. And they went back to their mission and their vision to pull out the values so then they could articulate what behaviors they were going to have in their response to the pandemic. And that was a really powerful thing to do that I think reflected this idea of coming from leadership as behavior rather than position and authority. One of the things I love about PTC is research. We bring a lot of writing and research and other things into the course. So I want to mention a couple of elements from the Leadership and Team Dynamics course that I think reflect this idea. One is Patrick Lencioni's The Advantage, a book that's really about organizational health, or what a lot of us would call school culture. I think he even references Peter Drucker and his famous quote that if you look on Google, I don't think he ever actually said that culture eats strategy for breakfast, but it's a great one. And Lencioni talks about that same idea that organizational health really is more important than anything. And to get there, he has this list of questions that can be really helpful for an organization to look at. And starting with why, those values, why do we exist? Simon Sinek talks about start with why as well, but I think that's a pearl for a whole other oyster that we won't get to today. And then how do we behave? What are our behaviors and how do they come out of those values? Then what do we do? How will we succeed? What's most important now? And then position or role of who must do what. And I think this is kind of a one-way street. You can go both ways, but you limit the options as you go farther down the path. And it's great to have all of our values at hand and decide what's most important. And then let that determine behaviors and then our positional approach. Starting from position is going to then limit behaviors and then further limit our values, which I think is the last thing we as individuals or as institutions want to be doing. A few other echoes of resources we use in our course. Brene Brown has been mentioned multiple times. She has a great exercise in Dare to Lead, and you can actually just find this in the workbook she posts online. It's called Living Into Our Values. We spent some time on my leadership team going through this. It was really, really tough to pick one value. She allows two if you really have to, that's most important to you, that leads you in the dark, that gives you purpose. And for individuals to go through that process and then share that with our leadership team was really, really fascinating. Jim Collins defines level 5 leadership, the best leadership and good to great, as those behaviors of indomitable will and personal humility. And how powerful is that and the values that those behaviors speak to, again, rather than coming from position and using that authority as a leader. Culture Code by Dan Coyle, we pulled into the course a little bit last year. And again, that speaks to organizational culture and the behaviors that build safety in a culture, that allow us to share vulnerability and then establish purpose, and very intentionally in that order. And then finally, Ken Blanchard in situational leadership, and that idea that as leaders, we need to sense the range of ability and attitude of others so we can intentionally choose the leadership style for the right people. Whether we're coaching or delegating or supporting can be different behaviors when we look carefully. We could go on and on and on, but I got to wrap up soon. Any Hamilton fans out there? Hamilton has been a lot of fun for us in our home. You know, the fundamental tension in this show is between Hamilton and Burr, and Hamilton being frustrated that Burr really doesn't have any values. If you stand for nothing, what do you stand for? In this frustration that he doesn't want to say anything, he just wants to smile so he can get into the position that he wants to. And it really culminates when when Burr and Jefferson are running for president, and everyone looks to Hamilton to have this kind of deciding endorsement. And even though he doesn't favor, of course, Jefferson's values of behavior, he knows what they are. He comes from that place first, and so that's who he endorses. And I think that's an interesting and powerful message. I maybe shouldn't get too political, but just quickly say that in modern political terms, maybe leadership is a behavior translates to leadership is wearing a mask. So leadership is behavior, not a position. I do want to finish with some of these big ideas with a small piece of advice of what do you do with this? And I would really encourage you to take time to reflect and clarify your values and what behaviors come out of that, and try writing it out. We write our educational philosophies often. We're looking for jobs. Where do your values and behaviors fit in there? And maybe it's not for that statement, but for something that's a little bit more personal, or maybe it's for your institution or your section if you're a principal. But defining that, reviewing it, have it in a place where you can see that often can be a great touchstone, I believe, for leadership. So I will leave it at that. I know I'm well over my 10 minutes, but hopefully we have a little bit of time to answer questions. Let me stop my screen share. There we go.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you for giving all of our participants today a little thumbnail of had we been in where I think you were going to be in Miami with us.
Yep.
Good thing you're not a great spot to be right now. But to give a sense of that notion that we do try to use the research, we do try to get to the thought leaders on how to help us do our work. There's a couple of questions coming in, but I'm going to ask one that's very for myself. Great idea that we should be trying to pick out that one value. And some of us, I think, on the call have been through that exercise where, you know, what is the one that your school, if you don't mind sharing, did you land on one that you then worked with and tried to associate the behaviors?
I would say, with continuing conversation and discussion, but compassion, I think is where we've really landed as that important point that brings in all of the elements of and connects the elements of our vision and mission, I think in a really powerful way. And we like that too because of what it says about behavior, and what it implies about both how students, teachers, and leaders should be behaving.
Yeah. And then the second piece of it is to say, you know, me as a leader, as even though the position is not the place we're leading from, we still have an obligation to lead. And what does that mean? What does compassion look like? And I could see we could go for another hour or two on, so one man's compassion is another one's something else, you know. But let me go to the questions that we're getting here. Let's see. What do you think will be the most challenging as school leaders plan for the days ahead?
Wow. You know, in trying to stick to the topic of my pearl, I think it is staying true to our values and our mission. I would hearken back to what Barry talked about on Monday a little bit too, is being really firm about what is most important to us as teachers and leaders, to make the tough decisions, and to really be looking out for kids, and also to do that in a way that keeps kids safe. I think that's one of the things that's really tough right now, is the conversations we're having are often quite scary, and remembering that those are happening around kids, often very young children, and how does our behavior and reactions and our words have an impact on their experience.
Yeah, and it's reminding me too of this whole notion of the anticipating and laying out the scenarios that could be. I think, you know, haven't had the chance yet to share pearls, my own pearls yet, maybe one day. But certainly, you know, the idea that we have to be prepared for all possibilities, and maybe part of the leadership role is leadership behavior is to have gone through the what ifs, you know, the set of what ifs, just in case.
And I'm maybe just mention probably what's been the most poignant moment for me in the last few months, going through this all is about a month into our distance learning. I had a Zoom meeting much like this with our faculty, and I decided I would do it from my office. And I walked through campus. We have quite a large campus, and I got about halfway through campus, halfway to my office, and I just got hit with this overwhelming sense of mourning and sadness. There was nobody there. It was dead quiet, it was silent, and I just kind of sobbed actually, and I realized that I'm surely was not the only one feeling that way. And so when I started my meeting with our faculty and about 170 people on the call, that's what I started with. Is I shared that moment, and I said it's okay and probably important to feel this way and express that and have that moment. And we spent a little bit of time wallowing in that sadness, and then we gathered ourselves together and we moved on. But I think that for me was an important thing to express, and important for others to realize that that it was okay to feel that way.
We have several questions coming in around that idea. So what are some specific behaviors that are associated with that particular sense of vulnerability? How is that perceived? So let me just read one or two here. Do you have any tricks on how to stay true to your values when you're stressed?
I would say have a sense of humor.
Maybe we should take the word tricks out of it, just, ideas.
Well, part of what I finished with is have a place where these important things are written down, because if they're not, it's easy to become uncentered. So I do have a list of those values that are important to me, and they're on a bulletin board where I can see them really clearly. And every once in a while, when I'm having those tough moments, I go back there. I've got to come from this place. So I'm doing what I hope is right. And I did talk about a sense of humor. I think one of the best things I did as a high school principal with our monthly faculty meetings was bringing in Whoops the monkey, which I wish I could cite where I got the idea. It's not mine, but I went first and said, this is what I really, really messed up, the mistake I made this month, and then challenged others, and we would take 5 minutes to see who could share kind of the silliest mistake that they made, and whoever had the best one got to keep Whoops the monkey for the month. But that created a little bit of a sense of vulnerability, and I joke sometimes the one of the best things I did. I'm the head of school now at my school, having been the high school principal, and in my first year as high school principal, we had an all-school faculty meeting. And we realized in January, as we were planning, that this was taking place, so it was an in-service day, on April 1st. And I pointed out, oh, great, we should do an April Fool's joke. And my head of school said, excellent, that's your task. That's your job for the meeting. So I'm like, oh, I've got months now where I have to come up with a perfect April Fool's joke. And it made it really stressful, actually, because the best part about humor, I think, is spontaneity, not 3 months of planning. And so what I did is I stood up at the beginning of that morning, and we were talking about some tough things that day. And I talked about how it was April Fool's Day. And what's fun about April Fools and the pranks and other things like that is they make us uncomfortable. They make us lean into that discomfort and be a little bit different, have fun in ways that we're not used to. I shared a couple of stories from my childhood in school where I had some great pranks. I had a 4th grade teacher who brought cupcakes that sat at the room and tantalized us all day long. And then she gave them to us at the end of the day, and they had cotton balls in the middle. And it was awful. But what I did is we were in the gym as I was sharing these stories, and I made sure to walk around where everybody could see me and make eye contact, having this conversation about being vulnerable and leaning in, and embarrassed everybody on April Fool's Day because I had intentionally left my zipper on my pants undone, and my shirt was even sticking out a little bit conspicuously. And so as I finished this trying to be deep statement about being uncomfortable, I asked, is there anything making you uncomfortable right now? And you could see people trying to decide, is he hinting at that? Does he know? Does he not know? What? And there was that wonderful moment and release of tension and laughter when a PE teacher finally said, is it that your zipper's not up? And I said, yes, that's it, April Fools. And we had a lot of fun. But as a leader, it put me in a place where people realized I wasn't all about my position. It was about creating good conversation and fun and having a sense of humor too.
That's a wonderful example. So we're giggling a little bit, myself, Zach, and Sky, because we had a similar cupcake incident in our office, right, Sky? Where Sky, who's a fantastic baker, you can see her up there, and she brought in, not surprisingly, some delicious cupcakes, except on April Fool's Day they had, what do you think they had in them? Anchovies. So I think that's even worse than cotton balls. Anyway,
I agree. Yeah, that's not good.
We do have
say in the Zoom context, I am wearing proper pants. After telling that story, I'll make it clear.
Yes, and we also, in the course of the leadership and team dynamics course, we do these sorts of simulations. You know, I see Carol Crittenden is on the call with us today, who's our coordinator every year in either our London or Rome sites, and many times we have set up simulations where we make people uncomfortable, you know, 2 people arguing when they shouldn't be, to help us get into what does compassion look like in that circumstance, or what does whatever value. So that's really the big exercise, isn't it, is to take those values and say really concretely, what might that look like in terms of yourself, your leadership team. We do have a couple of other questions, and we have a couple more minutes if you're okay. How do you moderate between conflicting needs and perspectives of parents and teachers and still ensure that they can understand each other's perspectives? How long have you got? Go ahead, try it.
I guess my response to that one is yes. No, that's a really tough one, and like you hinted at, you could go on. And what I would say is a lot of listening. and listening to understand, and make sure that they know you're listening to understand, not listening to respond or rebut. But a lot more listening before responding than we're often tempted to do.